The biting Montana wind whipped snow across Elias Thorne's face, stinging his eyes. He didn't resist the cold steel cinching his wrists, nor the heavy boot pressing against his spine, forcing him to his knees in the frosted earth. "All right, big shot," a gruff voice barked, the sound muffled by the swirling flakes. "What's in the bag? And who the hell are you?" Elias kept his gaze fixed on the distant, snow-dusted peaks, the familiar ache in his joints, a dull counterpoint to the sharp burn of the handcuffs. He offered no name, no explanation, just the slow, measured rhythm of his breath, a practiced calm that seemed to unnerve the uniformed man above him more than any struggle ever could. Only after the crude plastic zip ties had been replaced with regulation handcuffs, and Elias was being shoved into the back of a beat-up county sheriff's cruiser, did he allow his mind to drift above the crisp mountain air, the scent of pine and damp earth. It was a world away from the humid, choking jungles he usually operated in. But the principles remained the same: adapt, observe, endure. He was Elias Thorne, former Army Delta Force, currently operating under a deep-cover directive so sensitive even his immediate chain of command knew only fragments. His mission: to track a radical survivalist cell suspected of planning an attack on the regional power grid, hidden somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness of the Bitterroot Mountains. The cruiser jolted over a rutted logging road, the deputy behind the wheel muttering about trespassers and federal land. Elias glanced at the deputy's face in the rearview mirror, young, earnest, a little too eager to prove himself. He saw the flicker of frustration when Elias offered only silence to his questions, the growing suspicion as the deputy's gaze lingered on the subtle, almost imperceptible scar tissue on Elias' knuckles, the result of a botched rope, descent from a Black Hawk during a training exercise years ago. He was a ghost, a shadow, and for the operation to succeed, he had to remain one. They arrived at the small timber-framed sheriff's office in the blink-and-you-miss-it town of Lone Pine. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale coffee and disinfectant. Sheriff Brody, a man whose face was a road map of weathered lines and quiet authority, watched Elias with an unnerving intensity. No ID, no permit for the restricted zone, and a piece of equipment that looks like it belongs on a Mars rover, Mr. Thorne, Brody drawled, pushing a small, sleek drone across the table. "Care to explain why you were flying this thing over the hydroelectric dam's intake valves?" Elias remained silent, his eyes scanning the room. The old filing cabinets, the slightly off-kilter portrait of a former sheriff, the single, flickering fluorescent light. Every detail registered, analyzed, and filed away. He was assessing the situation, not for escape, but for compliance. His cover was thin, designed to be unremarkable, a quiet loner with a passion for remote photography. The drone, a custom-built stealth model, was a calculated risk. It was meant to draw some attention, a low-level ripple, but not a full-blown federal incident. He needed to be noticed by the right people, the ones he was tracking, not the local law enforcement. "You're making this difficult," Detective Sarah Miller, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s, said, leaning forward. She was the one who'd taken over the interrogation. "We've run your fingerprints. Nothing. No record. That's a problem, Mr. Thorne. A big problem." "No?" Elias met her gaze. Her eyes were intelligent, curious. He could sense her frustration, but also a sliver of genuine concern. "I understand," he finally said, his voice a low rumble, the first words he'd spoken since his arrest. It was a calculated risk, a small concession to ease the tension, but nothing more. "You understand?" Miller scoffed, running a hand through her short, practical haircut. "You're facing federal charges for illegal surveillance, potentially terrorism. Do you understand that?" "Yeah." He nodded. "I do." He had to appear cooperative, but not forthcoming. The operation was still active. Any hint of his true identity, any deviation from the role, could unravel months of work. Left alone in the holding cell, the silence was a comforting. Elias ran a thumb over the inside of his left wrist, tracing the faint outline of a scar from a training accident, a reminder of the unforgiving nature of his profession. He catalogued the sounds of the station, the distant hum of the vending machine, the clack of a typewriter, the hushed conversations of the deputies. He timed the patrol rotations, noted the blind spots in the camera coverage. It was an involuntary habit, a constant assessment of his environment, even when he had no intention of exploiting it. He observed the building's layout through the small barred window, the snow-covered parking lot, the faint glimmer of the distant mountains. He was a prisoner, yes, but he was also still an operator. The public defender, a young, overwhelmed man named Peterson, arrived the next morning, smelling faintly of old coffee and desperation. "They're talking about national security, Mr. Thorne," he whispered, his voice strained. "They've got the FBI involved. Your drone, it's sophisticated. They think you're scouting targets." Amen. Elias simply listened, his expression unreadable. He knew the risks. He had accepted them. As they prepared him for arraignment, Wells, the lead detective, the orange jumpsuit, the handcuffs, none of it seemed to diminish the man. He carried himself with an almost unsettling composure, a quiet strength that spoke not of defiance or fear, but of an absolute unwavering certainty. It was the patience of a predator, or perhaps a guardian. The Lone Pine County Courthouse was a relic, built of rough-hewn stone and dark wood, smelling of dust and forgotten legal battles. It was packed. Local gawkers, reporters from the state capitol, and a surprising number of men in dark, ill-fitting suits, positioned strategically around the room. Judge Hawthorne, a stern woman with an impressive mane of silver hair, looked down from her bench, clearly annoyed by the circus. "Your Honor, my client requests a continuance," Peterson stammered, adjusting his tie. "We haven't had adequate time to prepare. He's been uncooperative." "No." Before Judge Hawthorne could respond, a man in a crisp suit stood. "Your Honor, Special Agent Davies, FBI. We request immediate transfer of the defendant to federal custody. This is an ongoing national security investigation. Do you and this all?" Another suited man, this one from Homeland Security, chimed in, "Sir. We have intelligence suggesting this individual is connected to a known extremist network targeting critical infrastructure." The judge slammed her gavel. "Enough. This is still my courtroom. We will proceed with arraignment, and then I will consider jurisdictional arguments." The clerk began to read the charges: illegal possession of an unregistered drone, trespassing on federal land, refusal to identify, and suspicion of domestic terrorism. Elias stood impassive, his eyes fixed on some point beyond the courtroom walls, his posture perfect, almost rigid. Detective Miller, seated in the front row, found herself studying him, a knot of unease tightening in her stomach. He didn't fit any profile she knew. "How does the defendant plead?" Judge Hawthorne asked. Before Peterson could speak, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open with a resounding thud. Every head turned. A man in a pristine army dress uniform, adorned with a dazzling array of medals, strode silently down the center aisle. General Maxwell Vance. His presence alone commanded the air, a palpable wave of authority. Two equally formal military police officers flanked him. Veterans in the gallery instinctively rose to attention. Even Judge Hawthorne straightened, her eyes widening. General Vance approached the bench and handed a sealed document to the bailiff, who delivered it to the judge. As Judge Hawthorne broke the seal and read, her expression shifted from irritation to profound shock, then to a somber understanding. After a long, heavy silence, she looked up. "In light of this documentation from the Department of Defense," she announced, her voice strained, "all charges against the defendant are dismissed, effective immediately. This case is classified as a matter of national security. Court is adjourned." Her gavel struck the block with a sharp, final crack. The room erupted in a confused murmur. General Vance walked directly to Elias. The bailiff, moving quickly, removed Elias's handcuffs. For the first time, Elias spoke clearly, his voice carrying an unexpected authority despite its quiet tone. "General, my apologies for the inconvenience." The general's response silenced the room. "On the contrary, Major. The army apologizes to Chamachorstori." "Yeah." At the word, Major, every military person present, including the bailiffs and even Agent Davies, snapped to perfect, rigid attention, an unspoken display of profound respect. Detective Miller watched in stunned amazement as Elias' entire demeanor transformed. No longer attempting to be invisible, he stood taller, shoulders squared, the deliberate military bearing now unmistakable. Without the intentional posture of ordinariness, he suddenly commanded the room just as powerfully as the general. Judge Hawthorne herself, a former JAG officer, now stood and offered a respectful nod to both men. "Thank you for your understanding, Your Honor," General Vance said. "Major Thorne has been operating under classified orders. The situation required discretion." Outside the courthouse, reporters clamored, their cameras flashing. Elias, now changed into civilian clothes provided by the military officers, stood beside the general near a black government SUV. Sheriff Brody approached them, a battle of confusion and respect warring on his face. "General, with all due respect, my department deserves some explanation. We've been treating this as a potential terrorist threat." "See, Sheriff, I understand your concern," the general replied, his voice calm but firm. "Major Thorne is one of our most decorated special operators. The details of his assignment remain classified, but I can assure you he poses no threat to your community. Quite the opposite." Bensey. Detective Miller stepped forward, her face flushed. "Major Thorne, I owe you an apology." Elias met her eyes directly now, no longer hiding behind careful blankness. "No apology necessary, Detective. You were doing your job, and you did it well." He paused, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "In fact, your thoroughness was impressive. Most would have been satisfied with a simple trespassing citation." "Nay." An elderly man in a faded VFW cap approached cautiously. "Excuse me, Major. I was a grunt with the 101st in Vietnam. Been sitting in that courthouse all morning. I knew there was something familiar about the way you carried yourself." He extended a gnarled hand. "Thank you for your service, whatever it is you do." Elias shook his hand firmly. "Thank you for yours, Sergeant." The general checked his watch. "Major Thorne, we should proceed. Operation Stone Sentinel requires debriefing, and Washington is waiting for your report." "None." Sheriff Brody's eyes widened. "Stone Sentinel? The counterinsurgency operation that neutralized that militia group in Idaho last year?" "None or none." The general remained professionally vague. "Major Thorne has given 12 years of exemplary service to this country. Much of it will never be known to the public." "None." A reporter pushed forward. "Major, will you make a statement?" "No comment," Elias replied firmly. "And I'd appreciate privacy." As they moved toward the waiting vehicle, something remarkable happened. The local law enforcement officers present, including those who had arrested and detained him, formed an impromptu honor corridor. The military personnel among them saluted as he passed. Detective Miller watched, finally understanding what had seemed so odd about him from the beginning. He wasn't trying to hide guilt. He was trained to hide excellence. Sunset painted the rugged Montana landscape in hues of orange and purple. Days later, Detective Miller sat at her desk, reviewing the Thorne file, when her phone rang. "Wayne." "Detective Miller," she answered. "Detective, this is General Vance. We met briefly during the incident with Major Thorne." "May have tried him." Miller sat straighter. "Yes, sir. What can I do for you?" "Dial. I'm calling to extend an invitation. Major Thorne is receiving a commendation tomorrow at Fort Carson. Given your involvement in the situation, he thought you might want to attend." "No. I saw her." Miller was surprised. "I'd be honored, sir, but I'm confused. I arrested him." "Then, just one." Sometimes the people who challenge us most end up teaching us the most valuable lessons, the general said. The ceremony is classified, but we can arrange clearance. The next morning, Miller drove to Fort Carson, passing through multiple security checkpoints before being escorted to a small auditorium. The audience consisted of fewer than 50 people, mostly high-ranking officers and personnel in civilian clothing, who carried themselves with unmistakable military bearing. Miller took a seat in the back row. The ceremony began without fanfare. No press, no photographers. General Vance approached the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, today we recognize Major Elias Thorne for extraordinary service during Operation Stone Sentinel. For security reasons, I can only say that Major Thorne spent 11 months undercover identifying and neutralizing a critical threat to our national security. Miller watched as Major Thorne stepped forward in his formal Army uniform, adorned with ribbons and commendations. He bore little resemblance to the unremarkable man she had arrested in the snow. The general continued, Major Thorne established himself as one of our foremost experts in counterinsurgency and unconventional warfare after graduating first in his class at Ranger School. He became one of the first operators to qualify for the Army's Special Operations Detachment Delta, though this fact remains classified. Miller leaned forward, beginning to understand the magnitude of the person she had handcuffed and processed as a potential threat. During Operation Stone Sentinel, Major Thorne eliminated 16 confirmed threats while maintaining deep cover. His actions directly prevented a coordinated attack on 3 Western power stations that would have resulted in catastrophic loss of life. The general looked directly at Major Thorne. When your position was potentially compromised, you maintained operational security despite personal risk, even when doing so resulted in your detention by local authorities. Miller felt a flush of embarrassment, but she noticed Major Thorne nodding respectfully toward her. There was no anger or resentment in his expression. After the ceremony, Miller approached him cautiously. Major Thorne, congratulations on your commendation. Thank you for coming, Detective, he said, extending his hand. I want to apologize again for what happened. No need. You were doing exactly what you should have done, given the information you had, he replied. In fact, your thoroughness was impressive. Most would have been satisfied with a simple warning about federal land use. Miller shifted uncomfortably. If you don't mind me asking, why was it necessary to be detained? Surely you could have identified yourself to us privately. No, didn't he? Major Thorne glanced around, then led her to a quieter corner of the room. The operation wasn't complete. My cover identity needed to remain intact, even under scrutiny. The individuals we were tracking had contacts throughout local government and law enforcement in the region. If word got out that I'd received special treatment or identified myself as military, 11 months of work would have been compromised. So, you just let us arrest you. Sometimes the best way to maintain cover is to commit fully to it, even when it's inconvenient, he said with a ghost of a smile. Besides, I knew the general would intervene before things went too far. Another officer approached, signaling that he was needed elsewhere. It was good to see you, Detective, he said. Keep up the good work. As he walked away, General Vance appeared beside Miller. Impressive man, isn't he? Yes, sir. I've never met anyone like him. Wow. Few have. The general paused. You know, Detective, we're always looking for people with your attention to detail and persistence. If you ever consider a change of career, call my office. I know, this. 6 months later, Miller stood on the deck of a naval vessel, watching the rugged coastline of Washington state disappear into the distance. After 13 years with the Lone Pine County Sheriff's Department, she had accepted a position with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Her first assignment, liaison between local law enforcement and naval special operations along the Pacific Northwest coast. Her phone buzzed with a text message from an unlisted number. You, some of us are always around. Welcome aboard. Miller smiled, recognizing Major Thorne's words from the courtroom. She knew she'd probably never see him again. People like him operated in shadows. Their successes were never celebrated publicly. their sacrifices rarely acknowledged. But now she'd be part of the system that supported them, that made their work possible. She'd help ensure that the next time someone like Major Thorne needed to maintain cover, there would be protocols in place to protect both the operation and the local authorities doing their jobs. The captain approached. "Agent Miller, we're receiving reports of unusual activity at a private hunting lodge near our next port. Thought you might want to take point on this one." Miller nodded, understanding that her new role was beginning. "Yes, sir. I'll look into it right away." As she reviewed the preliminary report, she noticed a detail that made her smile. A man with unremarkable appearance, testing specialized surveillance equipment at extreme range. Some things never change. Months passed. Miller settled into her role with NCIS, developing protocols for identifying potential special operators in civilian encounters. Her experience with Major Thorne became a training scenario for police departments along the coast. Then one stormy evening, as she worked late in her office, a knock came at her door. Standing there, once again in rugged outdoor civilian clothes, with that deliberately unremarkable appearance, was Major Thorne. "Agent," he acknowledged with a nod. "Major," she corrected, gesturing for him to enter. "I didn't expect to see you again." "Plans change," he said, taking a seat. "I understand you've implemented new protocols for identifying operators in the field, based on our encounter." "Yes, it's helping prevent similar situations." He studied her for a moment. "Your work has been noticed, which is why I'm here. We need someone with your perspective for an upcoming operation." No. Miller leaned forward, intrigued. "What kind of operation?" "The kind that requires someone who understands both sides, law enforcement and military. Someone who can navigate the gray areas when they overlap." "I know. Is this official?" "Very," he said, sliding a folder across her desk. "General Vance recommended you personally." As Miller reviewed the documents, she began to understand the scope of what he was proposing. A joint task force targeting domestic threats with international connections, operating in the shadows between military jurisdiction and civilian law enforcement. "Why me?" she asked finally. Major Thorne studied her with those same calculating eyes she remembered from their first encounter. "Because when you arrested me, you knew something wasn't right, but you followed procedure anyway. You put duty above instinct. That's exactly what we need." Miller considered the opportunity before her. 6 months ago, she was a small-town detective. Now she was being invited into a world few civilians ever saw. "When do we start?" she asked. Major Thorne stood. "We already have. Meet me tomorrow at 600. Same hunting lodge where we first met." "And Agent Miller?" "Yes. This time, leave the handcuffs at home." As he departed, Miller reflected on the strange path that had led her here. From arresting a mysterious man in the snow to joining him in defense of national security, life certainly took unexpected turns. She glanced down at the classified folder on her desk, emblazoned with the operation name, Stone Sentinel 2. Tomorrow would mark the beginning of a new chapter. One where the lines between law enforcement and military operations blurred. Where success meant that nothing happened, and the greatest victories were the ones the public never heard about. 2 years later, Sheriff Brody arrived at the Lone Pine County shooting range an hour before dawn, his usual routine for the past 20 years. He was surprised to find the lights already on inside the main building. "Hello," he called, hand instinctively moving toward the small revolver he kept for emergencies. "Just me, Sheriff," came a familiar voice. Major Thorne sat at his old desk, reviewing what appeared to be satellite images. "Didn't expect to see you back so soon," Brody said, relaxing. "It's been what, 2 years?" 2.5, Thorne corrected, closing the folder. "And this isn't exactly a social call." Brody nodded, understanding. "Agent Miller called yesterday. Said I should prepare for some visitors." "She's a quick study," Thorne replied. "We need your range for the next 72 hours. Exclusive use." Brody raised an eyebrow. That's a big ask during hunting season. I know. That's why this came with the request. He slid an envelope across the desk. Brody glanced inside, saw a check with enough zeros to cover 6 months of operating costs. That'll do it. But, I would have said yes anyway. No. We do things properly, Thorne said, even when no one's watching. Especially then. Over the next few hours, vehicles began arriving. Unmarked SUVs, a communications van disguised as a utility truck, and a dozen men and women who, like Major Thorne, had perfected the art of being forgettable. By noon, the shooting range had transformed into a tactical operations center. Maps covered the walls. Communications equipment filled Brody's office, and the firing lanes had been converted to staging areas. Agent Miller arrived last, bringing equipment from the NCAA's field office. "Sheriff," she greeted with a handshake. "Thanks for the accommodation." "Couldn't say no when my country calls," Brody replied. "Besides, Major Thorne has a way of being persuasive without saying much at all." Miller smiled. "That he does." Major Thorne gathered everyone for a briefing. "For those who haven't been briefed, we've identified a potential security threat operating within 50 miles of this location. Intelligence suggests they're planning something significant within the next 48 hours. He gestured to the maps. "We have 3 possible locations for their operations center. We need to identify the correct one without alerting them to our presence." Miller studied the maps. "These are all civilian areas, 2 residential neighborhoods, and a commercial district. We can't just raid them." "No." "Exactly," Major Thorne confirmed. "Which is why we needed someone with your background, Agent Miller. We need to maintain a firewall between military operations and domestic law enforcement." Me? The operation unfolded methodically over the next day. Teams conducted surveillance, electronic intelligence gathering, and careful observation of the targets. Miller coordinated with local authorities, establishing cover stories and contingency plans without revealing the true nature of the operation. Brody watched from the sidelines, impressed by the precision. These people moved differently from ordinary soldiers or police officers. Late that night, a breakthrough came. A team monitoring electronic communications picked up coded transmissions from one of the target locations, an abandoned waterfront warehouse that, on paper, belonged to a shell company. "We've got movement," reported one of the analysts. "Thermal imaging shows at least 8 individuals inside, plus what appears to be weapons caches." Major Thorne studied the feed. "Miller, this is where it gets complicated. We have probable cause, but this needs to transition to a law enforcement operation." And Miller nodded. "I'll contact the tactical response team, but they'll need a briefing." "Give them the minimum," he instructed. "Foreign-trained operatives, planning domestic attack. Nothing about our unit or mission parameters." Aye. As Miller coordinated with local authorities, Major Thorne pulled Sheriff Brody aside. "We need one more thing from you." "Name it," Brody said. "When this is over, certain details will need to be forgotten. The equipment here, some of the personnel you've met, the exact nature of the operation." Brody smiled slightly. "Major, I spent 20 years keeping secrets for the county. Some habits don't break." Thorne studied him for a moment, then nodded. "That's why we came here first." "Well said. You were reliable." "Until the raid happened just before dawn. Local tactical teams moved in with federal agents, while Major Thorne and his team maintained overwatch positions, ready to intervene if the situation escalated beyond local capabilities. It didn't. The operation went smoothly. 8 arrests, a significant weapon seizure, and intelligence materials that would keep analysts busy for months. The official story released to the press mentioned only a successful joint operation between federal and local authorities based on anonymous intelligence. By noon, most of Major Thorne's team had disappeared, equipment packed into unmarked vehicles, leaving no trace of their presence. Brody methodically returned the range to its normal configuration. Miller found him replacing target stands. "Thank you," she said simply. For what? According to the news, I had nothing to do with anything, Brody replied. Miller smiled. Exactly. As the last vehicles prepared to depart, Major Thorne approached Brody one final time. This range seems to be a nexus point for interesting activities. Just a place where people practice their skills, Brody said. Some more specialized than others. Thorne handed him a business card with only a phone number. If you notice anyone else with unusual talents, this number reaches people who might be interested. Recruiting? Brody asked. Always, Thorne confirmed. The right people are hard to find, and even harder to recognize, he added. Brody nodded in acknowledgement. Take care, Major. As he walked away, Brody called after him. Major, was any of this real? The arrest? The courtroom? Or was it all part of the operation? Dummy. Thorne turned back. What do you think? Brody considered this. I think sometimes the most effective way to hide is in plain sight. Create a spectacle that people remember, but for reasons that distract from the truth. For the first time, Major Thorne gave him a genuine smile. You would have made an excellent operative yourself, Sheriff. I'm happy keeping the range running, Brody said. Someone needs to be here when people like you need a quiet place to practice. 6 months later, Brody noticed a young man at the range, early 20s, handling his rifle with unusual expertise. Nothing flashy, but his technique spoke of professional training. When he adjusted for a difficult crosswind shot without checking any instruments, Brody remembered Major Thorne doing the same thing fine. He watched for an hour as the young man systematically worked through different distances, recording his results in a small notebook. When he finished, Brody approached. That's some impressive shooting. The young man nodded politely. Thank you. I practice when I can. Eddie's military background. Brody asked casually. College shooting team, he replied. A perfect cover story. Plausible and difficult to verify. Brody nodded, playing along. Well, you're welcome here anytime. We get all skill levels. As the young man packed his equipment, Brody noticed a familiar movement pattern. The same efficient motions he'd seen from Major Thorne and his team. That evening, after closing, Brody stared at the business card Major Thorne had given him. The young man had been good, very good at maintaining his cover, but to his trained eye, certain things couldn't be hidden. He dialed the number. Identification, answered a neutral voice. Lone Pine, still vigilant, Brody said, recalling the authentication phrase Agent Miller had taught him. Go ahead. I met someone interesting today, Brody said. The kind of person you might want to know about. Details. Male, early 20s. Expert marksmanship with unusual training indicators. Giving cover story about college teams, but showing operational movement patterns. A pause. Assessment. Either he's one of yours testing me, or he's someone who should be on your radar. We'll look into it. Anything else? No. Brody hesitated. Is Major Thorne still active in this area? Another pause. Longer this time. That name isn't in our current operational database. Brody understood. Of course. Just curious. 1. Your contribution is noted and appreciated. 3 days later, the young man returned to the range. This time, a woman accompanied him, middle-aged, with the bearing of someone comfortable with authority. They practiced together, their interactions suggesting a mentor-student relationship. When they finished, the woman approached Brody while the young man packed their equipment. Sheriff Brody, she said, using his last name, though Brody hadn't introduced himself. I understand you made a call recently. Brody remained calm. I did. Good eyes, the woman said. He's one of our assessment candidates. Part of his evaluation was to shoot here without drawing attention. He's skilled, Brody acknowledged. But there are tells if you know what to look for. That's why we value observers like you, the woman replied. Sometimes talent spots talent better than our formal systems. The young man joined them. How did I do, he asked, dropping the pretense. Sheriff Brody identified you within an hour, the woman told him. You'll need to work on concealing your training patterns. He accepted the criticism professionally. What gave me away? Wind adjustment without instruments, Brody said. Major Thorne did the same thing. The man and woman exchanged a glance at the mention of Thorne's name. Thank you for the feedback, the young man said. May I come back to practice? Brody nodded. Any time. Though, you might want to deliberately miss occasionally if you're trying to blend in. Done. As they prepared to leave, the woman handed Brody an envelope. Our appreciation for your discretion and assistance. Inside was a new business card. This one with an embossed insignia Brody recognized from Army Special Operations, and a different phone number. We're always looking for training facilities and observers, the woman explained. If you're interested in a more formal arrangement. Brody considered it. After 20 years running the range, perhaps it was time for a new challenge. I might be. Major Thorne spoke highly of your situational awareness, the woman added. That carries weight in our organization. As Brody watched them leave, he reflected on the strange path his retirement had taken. From running a simple shooting range to becoming part of an invisible network that identified and nurtured the nation's most specialized defenders. He tucked the new card into his wallet next to the first one. Some people served in uniform for all to see. Others served in shadows, and some, like him, simply kept watch, making sure those shadows remained safe places for necessary work. The next morning, Brody arrived at the range to find a package waiting. A new high-end spotting scope with thermal capabilities and an encrypted communication module. The note attached contained only 3 words. Keep watching, Sheriff. Hi. He recognized the handwriting immediately. Major Thorne may have moved on to new operations, new identities, new missions, but his legacy continued here, in this small corner of Montana, where ordinary-looking people with extraordinary skills could practice their craft away from curious eyes. Brody installed the new equipment, understanding its true purpose. He wasn't just running a shooting range anymore. He was maintaining a waypoint in a hidden network, a place where those who operated in darkness could find momentary safety in the light. And if more young shooters with too perfect technique and too casual cover stories appeared, he'd know exactly what to do. Because some of them are always around. You just don't see them unless you know how to look.